my job in North Carolina was the coalition builder for politicians. So it was my job to convince, black, brown, labor, environmental, all kinds of progressive groups that fell into this tent that the Democrats at the time called kind of the out there tent, to just get everybody to fall in line and endorse candidates. And I would say 85% of the time the candidates did not actually represent their interests.
Right.
I could get, I would say, 98% of the leaders to kind of fall in line, sometimes through, I'll give you this appointment, or, we'll give you a spot on this commission, and sometimes cash. I mean, through legal means, but using campaign finance to make sure certain PACs get money and certain candidates get money. You were the only one I could not apply. And so when I was younger in politics, I was like, I do not like that man. He does not do what we want him to do. But I came to learn to respect it, and how you are one of the few leaders who are unbought and unbossed. So I ask you, why do so many people fall victim to very petty things? I'm talking about, I give a $250 banquet ad and I get some endorsements, but $250 will apply some people. How do you keep people together, and why do people fall for that small amount, and how do you stay principled?
That's three or four questions. Well,
you can handle it.
Well, let me talk about what we found with our movement. In every age, Darren, if you look at the history of America, true change has only come through moral dissent. There's not been a major transformative event in this country where somebody, when the odds were against them, had to stand for what was right versus what was popular or what was politically expedient. So William Lloyd Garrison, prior to the end of slavery, was arrested right here in Boston by a respectable mob for preaching that all persons are created equal. But he stood, and he helped put together the abolition movement that at first looked like it was overwhelming and would be overwhelming. But as Frederick Douglass, who also dissented later on, said, every day we're winning. He said, it always looks like you're losing. It looked like David was losing against Goliath. Mandela said, they would always tell you you can't be done until it's done. Henry David Thoreau, when he wrote his essay on civil disobedience, Ralph Waldo Emerson visits him in jail and says, Henry, why are you in jail? And Henry, in essence, says, with the injustices going on in this country, why are you not in jail? Harriet Tubman chooses to stand up. She escaped. She could have said, I'm out. I don't have to worry about anybody else. But she says something called her to go back again and again and again, even when some of the people she was trying to rescue didn't appreciate it. There was a justice named Justice Harlan, the only justice to dissent when the Supreme Court overturned the Civil Rights Acts of the 1870s. The Civil Rights Act in 1870 made it a felony for you to discriminate in your business. People forget that. But it was soon overturned in a reaction to Reconstruction, the proponents of deconstruction. Harlan from Kentucky dissented. Only one to dissent out of all the other justices. But it was upon his dissent that Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall built their case later on. You see what I'm saying? And Martin Luther King stands up on April the 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year to his death, and says silence is betrayal. Says, I don't enjoy this, but I must challenge America as being the greatest purveyor of violence. And he took on the Vietnam War. Who do we remember now? Do we remember the people that went along just to go along? Do we remember the people who said to Dr. King, if you do this, the grants are going to dry up, the support is going to dry up? Or do we remember Dr. King? All of the civil rights marches, whether it was Selma or Birmingham, they did not start with thousands of people. Birmingham, I think, had 57, 58 people in the first march. Selma just had a few people. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, recently on the Supreme Court, when it gutted Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, did an incredible dissent. She didn't just root it in the law, she rooted it in, she started talking about the moral arc of the universe. And this court better remember Bloody Sunday. In other words, she said to the Supreme Court, you're not the only supreme. There's something else in this universe. There's righteousness and justice will ultimately win. Now, she lost, but history is going to record that she was right, and we are using her dissent now to build our case against voter suppression that will be tried in the federal courts this coming August. So the first thing I think, Darren, is that nothing that we... Teddy Roosevelt, 1912, stands up and takes on the Republican and the Democrat Party. Talks about there are at least 5 moral things government should do. Get the money out of politics. This is 1912. He's a Republican. I mean, living wages, he says, is a moral issue and should be a part of our country. Health care for all. Wasn't Obama's idea at first? 100 years ago, Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican. He said public education ought to be fully supported. He was castigated for that, but he was right. Dwight Eisenhower said that funding public education was a matter of national security and a moral issue. So on and on and on, when you look down through history, there have always had to be persons who stand up and say, wait a minute, there's something here deeper than the politics of it. It's about how we fulfill either the great moral tenets of our Constitution, which, you know, by the way, our Constitution does not start with freedom. No, the preamble says establishment of justice, the common good. In fact, welfare is a constitutional word. How do we ever let people make welfare a bad word? Promoting the general welfare is the beginning of our Constitution. And then it says, then if you do these things, promote the general welfare, the common defense, establish justice, domestic tranquility, then you can have freedom and pass that freedom on to your posterity. But there is no concept in our Constitution of a freedom that's a freedom to abuse. That's a freedom to hurt. That's a freedom to be unjust. That's a freedom not to ensure and work for the welfare of all people. There's no concept of that. There's no concept of capitalism in our Constitution that is not a capitalism rooted in justice. A humane capitalism that is concerned about all people. So whether it's that moral framework or the deep values of our scriptures, I'm a preacher, I don't know how to be Christian without being concerned about justice. Because everywhere I read in the scriptures, whether it's Isaiah 10 where it says, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights. We don't even talk about the poor having rights, but the scriptures do. The same scripture that everybody's so big about putting their hands on when they swear themselves in the office. So somebody has to say, if you're going to put your hand on the scripture and you're going to swear to uphold the Constitution, we're going to make sure you know what's in both of them. We just came out of Easter. For me, and I'm reminded, Jesus was killed because he took on the empire. His first sermon, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. The Greek word for poor is patokos. It means those who have been made poor by economic exploitation. And when Jesus preached that first sermon, it says that day they sought to kill him. Not 3 years later, but that day, because he dared to engage the systems and challenge the injustices. So we believe in the movement that you have to have an agenda that hold people together, not a personality alone, but an agenda that's deeply rooted in our deepest moral values. Here's ours when we break it down. Number one, we believe that based on our deepest moral values of our Constitution and our religious tenets, that economic sustainability, addressing poverty, and labor rights must be a part of an agenda, and all of the policies that go along with that, from fair taxes to properly helping the unemployed persons. Number two, educational equality for all, guaranteeing every child access to a high quality, well-funded, diverse public education. Number three, fairness in the criminal justice system that deals with with the inequalities and injustices that impact black, white, and disenfranchised, black, brown, disenfranchised poor whites. Number 4, health care for all, guaranteeing health care for all, and guaranteeing environmental justice and a commitment to women's health. And then number 5, protecting and expanding the notion of equal protection under the law by expanding and protecting voting rights, LGBTQ rights, immigrants' rights, workers' rights, and women's rights. We believe those 5 areas are the centerpieces of a moral agenda. And then how do you keep people together? Lastly, you cannot build a movement by people helicoptering in to lead it. Dr. King didn't even do that. That's a way we misteach Dr. King. People said, you had the March on Washington. How did you have the March on Washington? Because you had activism in 200 cities around the country with leadership from the bottom. It wasn't just lead. And even in the conclusion of his speech on the March on Washington, he didn't say come back to D.C. You ever heard that speech? He said, go back to Alabama. Go back to Georgia. Go back to the slums and the ghettos of our northern cities. Go back to South Carolina. Go, in other words, build a state-based movement. So we believe you hold people together when you have you build an indigenously led, deeply moral, deeply constitutional, anti-racism. Gotta have racists, and you can't play. It's not. People say, "Is it race or class?" I say, "It is." They said, no, is it race or class? I said, it is. You have to hold the two together. Race, deeply moral, deeply constitutional, anti-racist, anti-poverty, pro-justice, pro-labor, fusion, transformative fusion coalition. Fusion coalition. And I wanted you to ask me about fusion coalition at a point. And that is the model we believe that can not only transform the South, but transform the nation.